number 5. And again, your note catchers can be found on 1020, number 2. All right, so carbohydrates. CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So common carbohydrates are going to include sugars, literally the sugar you eat. Yes, that sweet stuff, that is a carbohydrate. And starches. Starches are what we call complex carbohydrates. Think potatoes, think grains, think breads. Okay? Usually, and this is they are colorless, they are water soluble. So, again, water soluble means that they dissolve in water. And you know this if you've ever made Kool Aid, right? Like you have the water, you put in a little flavor pack, you put in a cup of water, you spin it around, and then the sugar sort of dissolves, right? It is water soluble. Carbohydrates will dissolve in water. And of course, they can be crystallized. The monomers of carbohydrates, which are our simple sugars, our monosaccharides, always have an elemental ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So that means 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. That is our elemental ratio of the monomer of carbohydrates, a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The monomer, the building block of all carbohydrate, is referred to as a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one, saccharide referring to sugar. Literally, that word means one sugar. The polymers, and remember, a polymer is a chain or a series of monomers, right? The monomers get together and make polymers. So a polymer of carbohydrate are disaccharides, literally meaning two sugars, and polysaccharides, literally meaning many sugars. So di, that prefix di means two, and the prefix poly means many. And this should have taken you through question number 5 on your note catcher. Number 6 on the note catcher. Carbohydrates are classified in groups based on the number of different monomers. So again, remember, the monomer is the building block of any of our macromolecules. The building block of a carbohydrate, once again, is called a monosaccharide. The monosaccharide of carbohydrate means one monomer. Disaccharides have 2 monomers. Polysaccharides, poly letter again means many, has 3 or more monomers. So the picture there on the bottom, we see 2 rings. So is that a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, or a polysaccharide? Anybody? The picture on the bottom of my screen. Mono, di, or polysaccharide? What do you think? It could be poly. How many rings do you see? These rings are sugars. Okay, so we see 2 sugar rings. So is this a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, or a polysaccharide? What do you guys think? Are we seeing 1 sugar, 2 sugars, or 3 sugars? 3 or more sugars, I should say. 2. So is this a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, or a polysaccharide? Yeah, disaccharide. Yep, absolutely. This is a disaccharide because again, I'm seeing 1 and then 2 sugar rings because these little rings represent a sugar If I see two of them, it's a disaccharide. If there was only one, it's a monosaccharide. If there's three or more, I have a polysaccharide. All right, so we are on number 7 of the note catcher. So all of our macromolecules, we said earlier in the notes, have a very specific function for living things. They have a main function for all living things. Excuse me. The main function for carbohydrates is that they are the source of short-term energy. So this was, like I said, this was our do now from yesterday. Again, if you were a distance runner, if you were a what's it called, an endurance athlete, so maybe you run, maybe you bike, maybe you're a swimmer, and you need to do your sport for like hours and hours and hours, right? Because like these marathon runners run for like 2 hours straight, that would like literally kill me, but whatever. Carbohydrates, number one, are a readily available source of energy. That is the main function of carbohydrates. Every living thing on the planet uses carbohydrates as a main source of short-term energy. So again, like if I was, like I said earlier, if I was getting ready to go and do a 50-mile bike ride tomorrow, or if I was going to run a marathon tomorrow, or if I was going to go swim the English Channel tomorrow, tonight I would want a carb load. I would want to eat foods with a lot of carbohydrates so I would have that energy available to me very, very quickly tomorrow when I needed it. Now, energy storage. Carbohydrates can be a form of storing energy, less common, but still doable. Animals store energy in terms of carbohydrates as glycogen. We will store that in our livers and in our muscle cells. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Like we store energy in our muscles. We've all heard that like, oh my God, the car flips over and the mom picks up the car to save the baby. Like we've all heard of that. And they always say it's like, oh, that's the adrenaline kicking in. And that's not necessarily false. But the reason why your muscles can fire like that all at once and flip a car in emergency situations, yes, it's adrenaline, but it also has to do with the glycogen available in your muscle cells. There is energy stored in your muscle cells right now in case you need it. Now, we normally can't like tap into that unless it's an emergency situation, and our adrenaline helps us tap into that. But it is there; it is available. For plants, energy storage takes place as starches. By the way, this is why potatoes are great food, because potatoes have a lot of energy stored in them because potatoes are starches. Grains are starches. So like your corns, your wheats, your rye, all of our grains that we love to make bread out of, that we make pasta out of. Again, this is where the plants store energy. So when we eat those things, we're going to gain that energy in the food. Carbohydrates can be used structurally as well. So they help build materials in plants and bacteria and fungus. If you recall from middle school, all of those things have a cell wall. That cell wall is made out of carbohydrates. If you've ever had the situation, and many of you I'm sure have, ever like squish a bug and hear it crunch? That ever happened to anybody? Yeah. When you hear that crunch of a bug when you step on them, what you're hearing crunch is their exoskeleton. So we have skeletons on the inside of our bodies. Bugs have skeletons on the outside of their bodies. If you're a fan of seafood, you might like crab legs, you might like lobster. That outside thing that you have to crack to get to the crab legs, to get to the lobster, that is an exoskeleton, and that is made of carbohydrates. And then finally, number 4 here on the bottom, it is a component of glycoproteins. What that means is glyco, as in thank you. Um, Glyco referring to glucose, protein referring to protein. Carbohydrates can bind very easily with proteins, and that helps build other structures like cell membranes. Okay, so we are now on number 8, the monosaccharides. carbohydrates. So these little ring structures, one little ring, these little ring structures represent monosaccharides. And we see one little ring, and then we see one little ring, and we see one little ring, and they're not bonded to any other rings. These are single monomers. They are what we call simple sugars. And if you were to taste glucose, galactose, or fructose, it would taste very, very sweet to you. Not that I recommend going out and like eating these things because they have almost no nutritional value, but that's okay. All right, so every single one of these, glucose, fructose, and galactose, all have the same chemical composition. They have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Remember the CHO, carbohydrates are made of CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And these are, again, are monosaccharides. So if you are, or if you know somebody who is diabetic, you hear them talking about their glucose levels all the time. And that's your blood sugar. That is the sugar that's floating around in your blood that is used as an energy source for your cells through cellular respiration. Now, if you are non diabetic, your pancreas is able to produce an enzyme that helps us regulate our blood sugar levels. If you are a diabetic, or if you know somebody who is a diabetic, their issue, their medical problem is that they lack the ability to regulate their own levels of glucose. So that's why they take insulin. That's why they might take metformin, because these medicines will, in some cases, not in every, because I'm not a doctor and I don't know how every single medicine works, but at least some of these diabetic medicines work to introduce those missing enzymes to help that person regulate their blood sugar. But glucose in and of itself is just a simple sugar, and it's used for cellular respiration, which is the form that our cells use to generate energy. Fructose. Fructose is a simple sugar found mostly in fruits and honey. Again, honey, very, very sweet. Fruits, usually very, very sweet. Galactose. This is a sugar found in dairy products, and it can be synthesized in your body. Okay, so again, glucose, fructose, and galactose, these are our simple sugars. These are 3 examples of simple sugars, the most common simple sugars that we come into contact with. Not the only ones, but definitely the most common ones. Um, and even though they all have the same formula, they have different structures. So if I'm looking over here at the structure, like this one is one, two, like they all, like this one is they all have slightly different places where the hydrogens are connected, slightly different places where other things are connected. So again, their structures are are different, and again, this is what makes them isomers. But I want to remind you that structure is everything, because structure, for example, and we learned this yesterday in one of our little videos, is the difference between pencil lead and a diamond. Like pencil lead, graphite, and a diamond are literally just carbon. The only difference between them is the structure of the molecules. So remember, in chemistry, the structure of the molecules is really important and can provide huge chemical differences when it comes to how those things behave physically and chemically. So isomers are important. Okay, here are disaccharides. This is number 9 in your note catcher. Okay, so we'll notice in our little pictures here, I have a one sugar ring connected to another sugar ring. Each of these pictures, from maltose, sucrose, and lactose, are all disaccharides. Something I want to point out, which maybe I should have already pointed out, notice how these all end in oses. Ose, galactose, fructose, maltose, sucrose, lactose. Okay? If you see a word that ends in ose and you're not sure what it is, and I'm like, what the heck is this thing? Is it what macromolecule is it? I am not saying every carbohydrate ends in the word or in the suffix ose, but what I am saying is that most of them that do are carbohydrates. If it ends in ose, it is a carbohydrate. Please remember, that does not mean that every single carbohydrate ends in ose, but if a word ends in ose, ose, it is a carbohydrate, because that ose refers to sugars, and we know sugars are carbohydrates. So Pro tip. All right, so disaccharides, these are going to contain two monosaccharides, two single sugars, two of the monomers that are chemically combined. And we see that little right there in the middle, we see those little oxygens. And again, that is going to be a covalent bond. And it produces carbohydrates with new chemical and physical properties. Because again, anytime you have chemical bonds happening, you are changing the physical properties, you are changing the chemical properties. And the bond between the monosaccharides is called a glycosidic bond. You don't really need to know that, but I always have somebody like, what is it? So there it is. There's a name for it in case you were curious. Okay, so what do we have? We have maltose. This is a way of storing starch in digestion. For those of you who maybe like milkshakes, maybe like malted milkshakes or a malt at an ice cream store, that is from maltose. Um, One of the byproducts of making beer, so whether actually it's beer and or what they call like the hard ciders, you have to add maltose to make that ferment. So the process of making alcohol, which has been with humanity since before the Egyptians actually, making beer, making ales requires maltose. So yes, this has been around literally since forever in civilization. Lactose. This is the sugar present in milk. Lactose is two sugars, a galactose and a glucose. Some of you may be lactose intolerant. Some of you may know somebody who is lactose intolerant. What it means to be lactose intolerant means is that you don't have the enzymes to process the sugar lactose in your body. So what that really means is that because you can't digest it, you get really gassy. It might come out kind of not so nice on the other side, if you know what I mean. Um, and yes, people who are lactose intolerant, just like people who are diabetics, obviously they're not anywhere near being as deadly as being diabetic. But people who do have lactose intolerance can take dietary supplements, which will add that lactase, the enzyme needed to process lactose. Yes. Okay. Sometimes it does that. I'm not even sure why, but I will fix it. How is it now? All right, I will talk loud because I don't know what to do. I have it at maximum at this point. It's at 100. So thank you for letting me know. I will just talk louder. All right, so and then sucrose. Sucrose is our common table sugar. So each and every one of you, probably right now in your kitchens, have plain, ordinary kitchen white sugar. That is sucrose. If you've ever flipped over the backside of any of your candies or your soft drinks or whatever, if you saw sucrose as an ingredient, it's not something crazy. It's literally just table sugar. And that is a combination of glucose and fructose because, again, it is a disaccharide, which means it is two of these little sugar rings. And again, if you see that os, please understand we are talking about sugars, which means we are talking carbohydrates. Last one for today is going to be the polysaccharides. Again, your polysaccharides are complex carbohydrates. Now, monosaccharides and disaccharides, if you were to taste them, taste very sweet. Your polysaccharides, because they are complex carbohydrates, do not taste sweet. They just because they've gotten really complex there. Here we see a polysaccharide. I have one, two, three, four rings of sugar, and they're all chemically bonded together. Again, when you bond things chemically, when you have a covalent, in this case, a covalent bond, and you have that bond, it changes the physical and the chemical processes or properties of these substances. All right, so some common examples of polysaccharides. Glycogen, we spoke about this earlier. Glycogen is how we store extra energy in our muscles and in the liver. We talked about starch. Starch are polymers of glucose. And again, this is a form of energy storage in plants. Cellulose. Cellulose, again, this is the structure that helps to build cell walls for both plant and for bacteria. And it gives the plants a little bit of strength and a little bit of flexibility. And then, I don't know, chitin. This is that crunchy exoskeleton that we already talked about. The name of that polysaccharide is called chitin. And again, this is an exoskeleton. So insects, arthropods would be like spiders, crustaceans, those are going to be like your lobsters and crabs. Um, all of these organisms have exoskeletons. They have their skeletons on the outside versus on the inside, like we do. And that's why, like when you step on a bug, you might sometimes hear it go crunch because you're actually crunching that chitin, that outer part. Side note, starch, again, that is the when we talk potatoes, when we talk breads, when we talk rice, when we talk grains. Um, those polymers of glucose, that energy storage in plants. And you've had potatoes, you've had rice, you've had pasta. It doesn't taste sweet. But again, that is because your complex carbohydrates, your polysaccharides, don't have that sweet taste, even though they're still made up of those simple monosaccharides. But again, when you put them together and you chemically bond them, they are going to have different properties. Fungus, by the way, like mushrooms, also use chitin in their cell walls as opposed to cellulose. Just strange little FYI moment. All right, any issues or questions about monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, or just carbohydrates in general?